afternoon, and good day to you. Welcome to the Feather of Light podcast. My name is Brandon Tilt, and today I'd like to jump into the topic of rites of passage and how, after reading about rites of passage in this book, it's called The Ultimate Journey, Consciousness and the Mystery of Death. It's by Stanislav Grof. I'm really starting to get curious about this idea of how those who don't experience a rite of passage might be linked to cases of mental illness, particularly those that are kind of like more psychopathological in nature, like criminals who commit violent crimes or sexual offenders, and these types of psychopathologies, as one might call them, that are essentially the expression of an unmet need turning into intense emotions, and then those emotions being expressed in ways that are harmful to others. So, firstly, what do we think of when we consider the topic of a rite of passage? So, depending on what culture you're a part of, depending on your ethnic background or your social identity, this can look very different. And I would say for many people, it's likely we lack some form of a rite of passage, at least in the conventional way. So just to quote this book, rites of passage are cultural and spiritual events in which initiates can experience, confront, and express powerful emotions and physical energies associated with what they refer to as perinatal and transpersonal matrices, which are basically these stages of infant and pre-infant development. And it says that which we all harbor in deep recesses of our unconscious psyche. So it really does look at how there's these deep-rooted desires that we all as humans hold or are born with, and how the manifestation of these deeper desires starts to come on from an early age, sometimes childhood, but I'd say more so in preteen, sort of, teenhood. It's where we start to notice these unconscious desires bubbling up and being manifested in a variety of ways. And Stanislav Grof would propose, and I agree with this, that when we're not able to channel those emotions or deep desires into some form of an initiation, that often would involve a community or a group accepting and holding space for those unconscious desires, we begin to form what we would, in a modern context, refer as pathologies, or those emotions get bottled up and start to, in a sense, boil over. So, not to focus too much on the technical jargon around it. I'm not trying to make this too fancy. I'm pulling from a book that's a little bit fancy in the language, but realistically, it's kind of simple. When we're teens, at least from a cultural, more traditional cultural lens, when we're teens, we ought to be initiated into adulthood. whether it be a man or a woman or whatever you choose to identify as, your community would create space, right? Your elders, your peers, the whole surrounding community would create a space for you to be initiated into adulthood. Now, I've read about, not seen, I've read about some pretty violent and aggressive and what we deem as just very unorthodox versions of this in certain indigenous traditions in the Amazon. Gosh, I remember reading about, I was at this indigenous historical museum in Iquitos and read about this one particular indigenous tribe from the Amazon where the women would endure, I would say endure because it's a lot of suffering, a lot of physical suffering. They would have to pull out each of their hairs as part of an initiation, all of them, and, you know, endure all sorts of tribulations in order to prove their womanhood. And it was actually designed to prepare them for the agonizing pain of childbirth. And for men, equally as, I'd say, torturous in ways, they would have to, you know, mutilate their flesh or, you know, severe starvation, you know, fasting, bloodletting, and, you know, there's just various ways to which they would be pushing their physical limits. And oftentimes they would be proving themselves to be like a warrior in a way, you know, like a capable hunter or a capable provider or someone who can endure the physical, I guess, pain and, you know, prove that they have the stamina required to go out and hunt in the jungle. So you have to consider the climates, the social climates, the environmental climates, the environmental climates to which that particular community is connected to. That would definitely play a role in the type of rite of passage that would be available, the type of rite of passage that would be necessary for this young teen to be initiated into the role of adult. And, you know, some common examples within Western culture might be the, you know, certain Jewish rites of passage, or it might be somebody's, usually they're linked to a religion, right? Usually it's linked to a particular faith, and that would be one of the things that would surround or be connected to the rite of passage. But I would say whether you are practicing a particular religion, having this rite of passage is something that is deeply beneficial to the individual, to their family, and to their mind, you know, for sake of these unconscious desires not being expressed in ways that are harming others or creating these, again, what we'd consider pathologies. I try not to say that word too much, but in this context, they're referring to what we'd refer to as psychopaths, oftentimes being children or teens that weren't initiated and didn't have access to a rite of passage, and then they're acting out those unconscious desires in that way. From my personal experience, I remember when I was, must have been 12. I just talked about this the other day, actually. So first of all, I never had a formal rite of passage. You know, as I explained in my previous podcast episode, I wasn't really into the Christian faith. I was baptized, young age. I don't know if that really counts, maybe, but it's a little different. And I didn't have any type of rite of passage when I was a teenager. But this was actually this event I did. So basically, I went out to a remote part of I think it was the Okanagan, with my uncle and his friend and my twin brother and a couple other cousins, and we basically just paddled out all our gear, all our camping gear, to a beautiful remote spot along a river. And we hung out there for a couple days and really enjoyed the beautiful nature and the river. I remember floating down the river because it was a fast enough current where you could get kind of it would float you along, but it wasn't so fast it would kind of carry you away. And we so happened to be in the middle of a thunderstorm. A really, really brutal thunderstorm, actually. And so at first, this was just a leisurely camping trip with the uncle and his friend and, you know, some of these young boys. And then paddling back with all our gear. It's quite a heavy canoe too. We got caught in this thunderstorm, and the way that impacted the river was that it was just like treacherous. This river was pushing us literally backwards unless you were able to paddle against this current. And it was freezing cold. It was pouring rain. We were soaked, and there was thunder and lightning, and you know, I was just like miserable. I hated it. I think we all did, probably. But thinking back, that was basically a rite of passage for me at a time where I didn't even really consider it to be one. So yeah, that was my form of that. But still, getting into my, you know, late 20s, around the time of my Saturn's return, I was really searching for something else I could consider to be a rite of passage. And in many ways, this is what prompted me to go to Peru and to drink ayahuasca in the manner I did, and to do the whole trip solo. I felt like the whole 5.5 months was essentially a rite of passage in a way. So I'd like to think that you could still do a rite of passage up until, I'd say, about your, I don't know, early 30s even. It's interesting because we think about how the male mind, at least, speculate the female mind's a little different, but the male mind, it doesn't stop developing until about 25. And I would say that you could probably sneak a rite of passage some point from your early 20s, or younger than that, I suppose, up until maybe about the age 30. And I would say the impact that has on your life is dramatic. But then, yeah, connecting it to this idea of where does a person start to go down the path that leads them to doing what we consider, and I'd agree with, quite heinous things, and having maybe a lack of remorse. And that's essentially the definition of a psychopath, right? There's a lack of remorse. You know, the person really feels like they're justified in their actions, or these emotional experiences, or the manifestation of these desires is just so intense and so justified in their experience that they don't have the self-awareness oftentimes to, well, reflect and make amends. I mean, I'm not overly familiar with the rehabilitation process for someone who, for instance, is a psychopath and has acted out on that in really destructive ways. But, well, actually, this is a interesting side tangent, is, you know, rite of passage, an excellent rite of passage that many people are familiar with, I would say, is the military. Now, that's a whole nother can of worms. That's a whole nother, I'd say, problem in itself. The culture around the military probably isn't quite as supportive as a rite of passage that would be experienced within a cultural tradition around your elders, where there's a lot of support, where there is, I'd say, healthy integration around that rite of passage. And additionally, you have to consider how going to the military, it's probably not always a consistent experience of really acting out on those desires in a way that isn't on some level feeling like you identify with that role, I suppose. Like, identifying with or maybe overly identifying. Like, you can identify with the role of being a soldier, but overly identifying with that might lead to feeling like this is who you are, and killing people. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast where they talked about this. Actually, it was David Cho. He said he had a friend who was a veteran, and I think he brought a really eloquent point here that some soldiers, obviously not all soldiers, but some soldiers, they use the escape of doing another tour as a means to escape what might just be emotional conflicts or intermarital conflicts or family issues at home. And by no means do I want to downplay the valor of and the sacrifice of these men or women that are fighting for the country, and I would say doing a very, very noble act. As a Ukrainian man, I highly and deeply respect those who are willing to put their life on the line and fight for their country. It's probably one of the most noble things a person could do. But then there could also be this sort of enabling of this escape, right? To go to another country and act out these unconscious desires. And it sounded like, at least in the case of David Cho's friend, it was kind of like he didn't want to talk with his wife, and he needed to just have some really hard conversations with her, but it was not really happening because he would go on another tour, and that would take him away from any access to her, or there's no real ability to give yourself the space to process, I would say, what's going on at home if you're not around. It's just a lack of presence. You're not being present physically. And I can imagine after a soldier experiencing what they experience and going through the, sometimes acquiring PTSD, sometimes not, but just the adjustment period afterward, that there's a lack of emotional presence, or they're feeling kind of absent, or they're still feeling like they're in a bit of a war zone in their mind. And so, yeah, just want to end this tangent with, I have so much respect for those who are soldiers or have been soldiers and are healing from those wounds, and maybe aren't receiving the support they need. To link this to something I've been listening to recently, in the Roman Empire, there was a lot of resentment among the variety of the Roman citizens were citizen soldiers, right? They were farmers, but they were also soldiers, and oftentimes would be enlisted. So what would happen is a soldier would go and fight for Rome, and they would fight for the glory of Rome and the economic benefits of that, but then they would come back to not much. They would come back to a life where they would have sold their farm, and the government doesn't really give them much, right? They don't really compensate them or take care of them or support them near to the degree to which the political figures and the generals were receiving the fruits of war. And there was a lot of resentment that built up around that dynamic of the soldiers fighting and giving so much and not actually receiving much when they return. And how that was proposed to be one of the things that led to the fall of the Roman Empire, at least one of the earlier Caesars. Pretty sure it was like the resentment was building among the citizens, particularly many of which were citizen soldiers. And then they decided, we need to overthrow this dictator that doesn't appreciate us and doesn't give us fair compensation for their time at war. And I would say there's likely a parallel there nowadays, where you see veterans whom aren't receiving, I would say, adequate mental health support, depending on what country, of course. But overall, it seems like they're not receiving the support they need, and some of which might turn to drugs, right? I remember when I was a teenager, I met a couple veterans downtown in Vancouver whom were heroin addicts. Actually, they were fentanyl addicts. And I don't know what their life was like before that, right? I don't know who they were or what their experience with drugs was before returning from their tours, but I can imagine the combination of PTSD and maybe the poverty and the difficulties adjusting might create a susceptibility to try out certain substances or escape from the pain and the flashbacks with using heroin or fentanyl. And addiction seems to be something that's pretty common among veterans. And yeah, to me, that's just so heartbreaking. And it might have just been a rite of passage, right? Just to connect this back to the theme I was talking about before. It might have just been a rite of passage they needed when they were a teenager or a young adult. And then they get thrust into this role and this title and this identity of being a soldier. And then throughout the course of their service, experience a lot. I can't even really do it justice. They experience so much pain and so much suffering and so much trauma. Then the trauma of just killing another person, whether it's in the line of duty or not, I feel like it would bear something on the heart. And then coming back and not feeling supported in that. But I wonder what it'd be like if they experienced a rite of passage before turning to enlisting, or maybe feeling like they understand what a rite of passage is, and then they get that from the military, and then they can kind of come to terms with what they want to do after that, and maybe there's a way to which they can integrate into society more easily. I don't know, I'm just kind of assuming at this point, but the rite of passage is like you go into, maybe I can check out this book again and it'll have some more specifics. Seems to be there's something about a safe and structured sacred context where they can act out these feelings, these sexual desires, these aggressive desires, and are able to, on some level, not feel dismissed or ashamed, to feel like, I can't speak to women who go to the military, and I'm sure there's a parallel there, but with men, so much of our archetype is about protecting and hunting, and our anger is demonized, and then there's this type of rite of passage, or this enlisting in service, military service, where all these things are okay. You're accepted and validated, and your feelings and desires are normalized by your fellow brothers at arms, right? Everybody's got to do that role and gets to enact on these desires. So can you imagine what it would feel like to be a young boy who maybe just wants to get a little aggressive and maybe likes to go and hunt or something, not to the degree with which they're killing things aimlessly. That's another story. That's where the psychopathology kind of leaks in. But I wonder where that line exists. I often find myself judging, and maybe for good reasons at times, but find myself judging people who hunt, seeing as this like escape into I'd say the manifestation of the desire to dominate or kill, or there's like a type of bloodlust if you want to be dramatic about it. But it kind of does follow that seems to be an unconscious desire that men have latent within their blood, within their ancestry, especially depending on certain lineages where there were warriors or they were hunters for a long, long time throughout history. And on some level, their genetics still hold that latent impulse. And finding healthy ways to channel that in our society could be video games, right? I think this really gives a whole new perspective to those who are addicted to video games, trying to act out these desires to, I don't know, be a little bit violent and, like feel that level of camaraderie while doing so, right? Amount of men that love playing Call of Duty. And like, what other options do they have? I mean, fighting professionally, I suppose, or training in gyms and stuff like that. But psychopathology, as I understand it, there feels like maybe there's just like a deeper longing for a type of experience that they just don't know how to understand or comprehend. And I would say likely faced a lot of shame and rejection around at a certain point in their life. And then it's kind of like this inner rebel, right? I'm using the parts language. There's this inner rebel part that's like, I'm sick of people telling me what to do, how to do it. I just want to be free in a way. And do I feel like we should listen to that part and let it rule our life and do whatever the hell we want? No, I don't. I feel like that's anarchy. If each of us acted out our unconscious desires and our impulses, maybe we'd see something similar to the Dark Ages. Throughout history, I'm sure there was more of a, I wouldn't say acceptance, but it was probably normalized on some level. But then at this point in, our world and society, it makes sense that we have more order and people are held accountable for their actions more, I'd say, ideally. Maybe not in every country in every way, but more people are held accountable. There's a justice system that holds people accountable. And not any man has every man has access to the same degrees of, I'd say, what's called sublimating. So sublimating is when you take something that's a problem for you. It's just a desire that you don't know how to channel, and you find a healthy outlet. So a soldier who maybe at a young age is just really aggressive, really violent, really out of control, and then they find a way to protect people and be of service, that's a form of sublimation. And I feel like many of us, when we find our purpose or our vision for our future, there's a way to which we're able to accept the fact that we are humans with these unconscious desires and sublimate that into a way that's supporting other people. Or, I'd say in many ways leads to the least consequences too. So I suppose this idea of rites of passage and the lack of them leading to people whom are essentially the delinquents of society, that feels like, wow, would it be hard for someone who is in a position of poverty and doesn't have access to some of the things I've talked about? Maybe they don't even have access to video games. I mean, most people do, but they don't have access to a community or some kind of sacred container to help them process these feelings. What it would be like as a child, maybe with a lack of guidance, maybe with a lack of a good father or mother, a role model, to have to try and sit with and make sense of these feelings, and going down this kind of shame spiral of further bottling down and further shaming themselves for feeling angry, or kind of like they want to dominate something in some way, right? There's this degree to which masculine energy, it's meant to take action, it's meant to change things, it's meant to contain things. The quote unquote healthy masculine, right? The fully embodied masculine finds ways to support themselves and support others through the manifestation of that energy. But then there's the disembodied or masculine whom doesn't have, I would say, balance within their impulses, or essentially that balance within their impulses. And that's where we see a lot of manipulation and a lot of abuse and a lot of harm to other. And I suppose the rite of passage is just a vital aspect of a healthy culture. Right? There's this function of having that safe space, having it be contained by elders, elder males or elder women, who understand and accept and validate the experiences of this youth. You know, just giving them a space to just be a boy or be a girl, or, you know, however you identify, just being in your authentic expression of your energy. And then what happens to this child when they don't get that? You know, they feel, like I said, shame, rejection, alienated, isolated. Maybe there's a lack of trust that forms when they don't feel like they can trust other people, or their sense of self-worth is very low because they feel like there's something wrong with them, right? Like they're the odd one out. And I mean, I get that we can't just treat every situation the same. If there is someone whom is actively harming people from a young age, there needs to be an intervention of, well, some sort, whether it be a healthy role model or whether it be friends whom care about that person and try to talk some sense into them, or maybe some kind of more extreme intervention, which I think does happen oftentimes. It's like it takes a person hitting their low for something to really set that boundary. And it's kind of like when a criminal is acting out in really, really outrageous ways. Maybe, I'm kind of assuming here, but maybe there's an inner child that's so wounded and is just searching for somebody to contain them the way they needed at that rite of passage. And wow, does that get complex, because then you have to look to the incarceration systems, how that healthy, safe, sacred context is not being provided when they reach going to jail, or something else that's kind of like barring them from society. It's in a way telling them that you were always not, I suppose, worthy of having access to this type of containment. I'm just sort of thinking that would be the message that would get essentially, it's the kind of message they would receive from that. So I'm not trying to, this is a tough topic to speak to, because I don't want to excuse the behaviors of people that are in many ways doing so much harm in society. I really do feel like there is a need for protection and justice and containment from healthy masculines or healthy feminine energies to help support and bring them back up to a standard of integrity within their actions. I just feel like for doing that from a place of further condemning people, right? Treating them like they are less than or unworthy of just basic things like love, which, by the way, I think is basic, but we don't treat it like it's basic. How that further sharpens the edge of rejection and shame. And this is where I'd say it's the accumulation, right? Like, I don't think nobody wakes up or is born into this world a hardened criminal, or I'd say a psychopath. I'd say there's the result of the combination of trauma, certain societal conditions that don't give them access to rites of passage, and then a series of experiences, confrontations with authority that tells them they are less than, and they have to keep putting up those walls, and the accumulation of their interactions and their experiences. And a person gradually declines to a point of essentially feeling like they're an animal. And that's kind of what you see in the media depiction, is like these all these killers and stuff. They kind of see themselves as an animal, and they're treated like an animal, so they just act out on animalistic impulses. Anywho, I feel like this is probably the extent to which I could go with this topic. It felt like it branched out a bit. I was looking at the rite of passage and the connection to certain forms of psychopathology, right? And then really just considering how the military complex plays a role, and the prison system plays a role, and the lack of healthy conversations around what masculinity looks like plays a role, and maybe even just having peer groups that are all just reflecting back to that person that they're not going to receive that safety. They're not going to, on some level, have a healthy outlet, at least at that point of their life. So I guess my final curiosity would be, what happens to this male that's had to harden themselves and been rejected for so long, when they finally start to feel accepted or find a place of belonging, or they get in touch with some kind of spiritual container that allows them to express themselves in a way where they can start to question this internalized shame and question this identity of being a monster or an animal that they might have internally, right? The belief system underneath of it all. And then I would say that they get to really witness that part of them differently, right? They're no longer in the space of demonizing who they've become and how their parts have chosen to protect them. And maybe there's a connecting with faith or a spiritual higher power. Maybe there's just an ability to look deeply and finally have the space to accept themselves as who they are, as maybe having some desires to go out there and hunt something, or having some desires to, pursue women. But I would say that's a delicate subject, because like they need to do so in, I'd say, a healthy way. But where can a man go? I'm curious, where can a man go where they can learn about healthy boundaries and healthy relationships with their sexual energy? Well, okay, where could they go? Men's containers. Men's work. What would have been part of, I'm assuming, many of these traditions where there's a rite of passage, you'd be held by your brothers, you'd be held by your sisters, you'd be held accountable. There'd be a collective teaching involved. And then there would, of course, like I've said many times, an elder who I'd say supervises or sees over the development of the men or the women in that way. So when we see a rise of delinquency or manipulation and abuse, or even if you just look to like certain political figures and you're like, what the hell happened there? I almost just feel like they need some good friends, some healthy friends, or maybe even to drink ayahuasca. This is something that my main takeaway from Lex Fridman's interview with Donald Trump was he asked him about drinking ayahuasca, and I felt that was probably perfect, because what would it be like if some of these politicians drank ayahuasca or took mushrooms? How might that reorient their beliefs and maybe on some level change their personalities in a way that would actually make them more balanced and open leaders? Maybe they'd gravitate towards other humans and surround themselves with other humans who feel like they aspire to do the same. So I don't know. Will some of these political leaders find their way into a healthy circle where they can really rehabilitate whatever parts of them are just run wild? I don't know. I really don't know what the solution is on that note. But can you imagine if someone whom, like, if you've seen Boys in the Hood, that's a beautiful example of when someone's in poverty and they've become a killer. They've become, in a way, so connected to all these impulses of violence and aggression. But what happens when the right person influences them? The right role model steps in and shifts their perspective. The teacher at an alternative school, or the counselor for youths, or the probation officer, or the elder who maybe went that route, walked the walk, maybe lived a troubled life, and then they found their way back to a place of what I would say would be moral integrity. So who might these figures be? How can you as a person, maybe you're down a troubled path, maybe you're not, but just recognize the importance of having these role models that support people whom maybe have lacked a rite of passage, whom maybe didn't receive the support they needed during a challenging point of their life. I mean, that's another piece of it, right? Trauma. Can you imagine there's a male or female who doesn't receive any rite of passage. They don't know what to do with all these impulses. And then trauma comes into the equation, some big event. Maybe they lost someone they loved deeply, or maybe they were a victim of some horrific abuse. How can we support a person in that situation? What kind of person do we need to become? What kind of adult? Because we're all adults, mainly. Depends what age you're listening, I suppose. Becoming elders. And how can we create safety for those who need it the most? Right? Someone who's, I think we all equally need and deserve healthy relationships with elders, healthy relationships with older men or women who can show us healthy boundaries, who can receive us and accept us and love us unconditionally, and maybe guide us a little bit and show us the way. So I suppose the theme of this episode is, how can you be a healthy role model? What does it look like to be a healthy role model in your community? Yeah, how can you support the youths, especially the troubled youths? What ways can you bridge that gap, which I would say definitely exists, So maybe you took something away from this podcast about understanding a rite of passage and the importance of it. Maybe this was just more of becoming more aware and understanding for those whom are part of our, what we call the sort of criminal demographic, or those whom are struggling just to, I suppose, like, not get consumed by their demons, and not just to judge them as other, not just to see them as less than, try to actually understand the situations. Like, these are people that are out there struggling, maybe with addiction. These are people that are out there maybe doing things that we just don't agree with. And as opposed to just continuously condemning them and judging them to be less than human, just trying to recognize that there's shared humanity and there's shared pain. That each of us were a newborn baby at some point in our life, capable of everything, deeply desiring connection, deeply desiring just to be loved and accepted. And we really don't know what a person's been through. We really don't know what another person's been through. So maybe think about that next time you see a person that you just have the hardest time in the world loving. Just there's hatred, there's resentment, there's disgust. Check in with those parts of you. Check in with those emotional experiences. And maybe if you've gained some perspective from this podcast episode, you can find a way to understand them and offer them some degree of support. So thank you for tuning in today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and take care for now. And just to let you know some of the things that I'm doing in this community. First and foremost, if you're looking for one-on-one counseling, I offer counseling applying parts work as well as art therapy techniques. I'm also going to start creating group containers. Some of these containers will be looking at integrating plant medicine. Other containers will be helping teach people about applying parts work in their own personal life. So if you're interested in any of these offerings, please reach out over Facebook, Instagram, or you can